The 1960s and the 1970s were brutal, and so were the bikes. No button to push, no screen to check, no computer deciding what your engine needed, no anti-lock braking system to help you brake in a life-threatening situation. You want a 1960s or 1970s bike to fire up on a cold morning? That was on you. Your leg, your timing, your feel for the machine. You'd better wake up half an hour early, because if the bike had a bad day, you were late for work. Every rider who swung a kick lever, wrestled a choke, or nursed a set of points back to life knows exactly what's coming. This isn't a list of old parts. This is a list of memories of your first motorcycle that you'd already forgotten. There was no button. There was a lever, and there was you. Starting a motorcycle from the 60s and 70s wasn't an action. It was a negotiation. You'd find neutral, or sometimes deliberately leave it in gear and use compression to your advantage. You'd swing your weight down through the lever in one clean motion, not a stomp, a push, timed with the engine's own resistance. Get it wrong, and the kickstart would snap back and catch your shin. Every rider from that decade has a scar or a story, usually both. But here's what made it brilliant. A kickstart needed nothing, no battery, no starter motor, no wiring harness to corrode or short out in the rain. If your bike had been sitting in a barn for 3 years, a kickstart didn't care. Clean the plug, check for fuel, and your own leg provided the power, not a chemical battery slowly dying in the cold. You learned your bike's specific mood the way you'd learn a person's, through repetition, through failure, through the mornings it caught on the first try and felt like a small victory before you'd even left the driveway. And when it worked, when the engine settled into that first rough idle, there was a satisfaction pressing a button we'll never replicate. You made that happen. Electric starters killed the kickstart almost everywhere except dirt bikes and a handful of holdouts who refused to let it go. The convenience was obvious. Turn a key, the engine started. Nobody needed a story about shin scars anymore. But something got lost in that trade. It is not that the old way was better in every sense. It wasn't. It is that it was yours in a way modern starting never quite is. Every biker who rode in the 60s and 70s remembers exactly what their kickstart felt like. But getting the engine running was only step one. Keeping it running long enough to warm up brought its own small ritual, one that started the second the engine caught. Before you could ride anywhere, you had a ritual to perform, and it started with the choke. A cold engine wouldn't just start and run, it needed a richer fuel mixture to catch, which meant pulling the choke lever to restrict the air intake. You'd kick it over, feel it sputter to life rough and uneven. Then came the part every rider remembers with almost affectionate irritation. Easing the choke back in as the engine warmed, watching the idle change, listening for the moment it was ready to run clean. Push it back too fast, and the engine stalled right there in your driveway. Leave it out too long, and you'd flood the carburetor, fill the garage with the smell of raw gasoline, and walk into work smelling like a gas station. This wasn't a flaw. A carbureted engine without automatic enrichment genuinely could not manage its own cold start mixture. The choke lever was you, doing the job a computer does automatically now, using nothing but feel and experience. Riders developed an intuition for their own bike's choke behavior they couldn't have explained to someone else. How far to pull it, how long before the first crack back in, whether this particular bike liked a little throttle blip along with it. Fuel injection and automatic chokes made all of this invisible. Efficient, certainly, but that little ritual, choke out, kick, wait, ease it back, was a small daily conversation between rider and machine that doesn't happen anymore. Anyone who rode a carbureted bike in the 60s and 70s can still describe their choke's exact behavior from memory. But once the engine was warm and you were ready to move, there was one more piece of hardware standing between you and the road, and it lived entirely in your left hand. Every rider from the 60s and 70s knew the term bite point, and they had found it themselves by feel, with no manual telling them where it was. The clutch was operated by a steel cable that stretched gradually over weeks of riding until the lever felt different in your hand than it had a month ago. Too much free play, and the clutch would not fully disengage. Too little, and it would slip under load, robbing you of power exactly when you needed it. So you adjusted it yourself. A knurled nut at the lever, sometimes another at the engine case, turned by feel until it sat right. It took maybe 5 minutes once you knew what you were doing. The first few times, it took a lot longer. Plus, at least one embarrassing stall at a red light with everyone watching. What made this genuinely clever was how simple the whole system was. No hydraulics, no fluid to leak, no seals to fail. A cable and a spring, and 2 adjustment points, entirely serviceable by anyone with a wrench and a bit of patience. If it stretched again next month, you adjusted it again next month. It never became a repair. It just became routine. Hydraulic clutches eventually took over, self-adjusting in a way cables never quite managed. Nobody misses cable stretch on a rainy Tuesday morning. But there was something honest about a system you could fully understand with your own hands. No diagnostic tool in sight. Underneath you, though, was a part that demanded a completely different kind of hands-on knowledge, one measured not in adjustment, but in patience. A 60s and 70s motorcycle wheel wasn't manufactured as a single piece. It was built, spoke by spoke, by hand. 36 or 40 individual steel spokes, each threaded through the hub and laced to the rim, then tensioned individually until the wheel spun true. Get the tension uneven, and the wheel developed a wobble you'd feel through the handlebars at speed. The fix wasn't replacing a part, it was truing the wheel, tightening some spokes, loosening others, spinning it slowly and watching for the wobble until it disappeared. Plenty of riders learned to do this themselves because a bent rim from hitting a pothole was a routine hazard, and a competent home mechanic could true a wheel with a spoke wrench rather than waiting on a shop, usually while cursing whoever left that pothole unmarked. There was real engineering behind the simplicity, too. A laced spoke wheel flexes slightly under load, absorbing small shocks the rigid frame, and forks couldn't. It's part of why these bikes rode as well as they did on rough roads. The wheel itself was quietly doing suspension work nobody gave it credit for. Cast alloy wheels eventually replaced spokes on most street bikes, nothing to true or tension. An obvious upgrade for everyday riders. But something was lost too. The wheel that could be rebuilt piece by piece, indefinitely, by someone with basic tools and patience. Those wheels were only half the story of stopping, and slowing one of these bikes down asked just as much from the rider as starting one did. Squeeze a modern brake lever, and a disc responds instantly, predictably, the same every time. A drum brake from the 1960s and 1970s asked more of you than that, and it gave you less warning in return. Inside the drum, curved brake shoes pressed outward against the metal drum when you pulled the lever, connected by cables or rods rather than hydraulic fluid. It worked, but differently depending on how hot the drum had gotten, how recently it had rained, how worn the shoes were. Riders learned to brake earlier, to leave more room, a lesson most of them learned the hard way, once, and never forgot. Adjustment was manual too. As the shoes wore down, the lever would start to feel soft, traveling further before the brake actually engaged. The fix was a simple adjuster, often just a screw at the wheel, turned until the lever firmed back up. Riders checked this the way people check tire pressure now. What drum brakes did well was survive. Fully enclosed, they were protected from mud, water, and road grime in a way early disc brakes, exposed and unshielded, simply were not. Disc brakes eventually won, And for good reason, they offered better feel and more consistent stopping power. But the drum brake asks something of the rider the disc doesn't: attention, anticipation, a working knowledge of exactly how much stopping power you had left in reserve. And speaking of what you had left in reserve, nothing tested a rider's attention quite like the moment the engine started to stumble for no obvious reason at all. There was no fuel gauge. There was a tap under the tank with 2, sometimes 3 positions, and your own sense of how many miles you'd covered since the last fill-up. You'd be riding along, everything normal, and then the engine would start to stutter, losing power, coughing, threatening to die right there in traffic. And in that half second before panic set in, every rider from that era knew exactly what it meant. Main tank was empty. Reach down, find the tap, twist it over to reserve, and pray you'd bought yourself enough miles to find a gas station. It wasn't a warning light, it was a physical decision made under a bit of pressure, usually at the worst possible moment, merging onto a highway or 10 miles from the nearest town. And it worked precisely because it was so simple. A second, smaller reserve of fuel sitting below the main tank's pickup, accessible with one twist of your wrist without even taking your eyes off the road. The genius of it was how little it needed to function. No sensor, no float, no wiring, nothing that could fail electrically. Just gravity, a second outlet positioned slightly lower in the tank, and a rider paying enough attention to notice the first stutter before the engine actually died. Fuel gauges eventually made this whole ritual obsolete. Safer, certainly, but that jolt when the engine first coughed, followed by the small relief of finding the tap and feeling the bike smooth back out, that's a specific memory shared by absolutely everyone who rode before fuel gauges existed. Keeping that reserve running smoothly, though, depended entirely on one part downstream doing its job properly, and that part demanded more patience than almost anything else on the bike. If there's one part on this list that every single rider has a genuine grudge against, it's the carburetor. In a mall-style carburetor mixed air and fuel using nothing but airflow, a needle, and a set of adjustable screws, no computer, no sensor, nothing measuring anything electronically. Get that mixture right, and the engine ran clean, responsive, strong through the whole rev range. Get it wrong, and you had a bike that idled rough, stumbled off the line, or fouled its plugs every other ride. And getting it right meant hours of trial and error. You'd turn the idle mixture screw a quarter turn, start the engine, listen. Turn it again, listen again. There was no diagnostic tool telling you the air-fuel ratio. You tuned entirely by ear, by the way the engine note changed, by how it responded when you blipped the throttle. Riders talked about carburetors the way people talk about difficult relationships, constant compromise, the occasional argument, and real satisfaction when things finally clicked. Altitude changed it. Temperature changed it. A slightly worn needle changed it. Something that ran perfectly in your garage on Saturday could run rough on a mountain pass on Sunday. And you'd be back to turning screws by the roadside, cursing quietly, getting it close enough to limp home. But that hands-on tuning was also the whole point. A carburetor was rebuildable, adjustable, entirely mechanical, something a patient rider could fully master with a screwdriver and enough Sunday afternoons. Fuel injection eventually replaced it with computer-controlled precision that never needs tuning and never runs rough at altitude. Objectively better. But nobody ever bonded with a fuel injection system the way riders bonded with a carburetor they'd finally, after months, gotten to run exactly right. By the 1970s, if you rode a two-stroke, you were also, quietly, a chemist. Two-stroke engines burned oil along with their fuel, and unlike a four-stroke, that oil didn't stay in a separate reservoir doing its own thing, and it had to be mixed directly into the gasoline, in the right ratio, every single time you filled up. Too little oil and you'd wear out the engine. Too much and you'd foul the plugs and choke the bike in blue smoke. The ritual was the same at gas stations everywhere. Pull up, unscrew the cap, pour in your fuel, then add your own bottle of two-stroke oil in careful measured amounts and give the bike a shake to help it mix. Some riders eyeballed it. Some carried a proper measuring cup. Everyone had their own method, defended like a family recipe. And you knew immediately if you'd gotten it right, because a two-stroke told you everything through smell and smoke. Get the ratio close, and you got that sharp, sweet exhaust smell and a light blue haze on startup. A smell an entire generation of riders can still recognize instantly, decades later, walking past a lawnmower or an old chainsaw. Oil injection systems eventually took over, metering the oil automatically so nobody had to mix anything by hand. Cleaner, more consistent, less smoke. But that blue cloud and that specific gasoline and oil smell were the actual scent of being a teenager on a bike, and nothing since has smelled quite the same. Before an engine can run, it needs a spark, timed perfectly, thousands of times a minute. In the 1960s and 1970s, that job belonged to a small set of contact points, and keeping them working was a skill every serious rider eventually picked up. The points opened and closed mechanically as the engine turned, interrupting an electrical circuit at exactly the right moment to fire the spark plug. Simple in theory. In practice, the metal contacts wore down and pitted with use, and the gap between them, measured in thousandths of an inch, had to be checked and adjusted regularly, or the engine would start running rough, misfiring, losing power for no reason you could see just by looking at it. The fix was a feeler gauge, a small screwdriver, and patience. You'd rotate the engine by hand to the right position, slide the gauge between the points, and adjust until the gap sat exactly where it needed to be. Get it slightly wrong and you'd feel it immediately. Hesitation, backfiring. A bike that just didn't pull the way it should. It was maintenance that demanded real attention, on a schedule, whether you felt like doing it or not. Electronic ignition eventually eliminated points entirely, replacing the whole mechanical dance with a sealed system that never needs adjusting and never wears out the same way. More reliable, undeniably. But it also removed one of the last places where a rider's own hands directly touched the exact moment the engine came to life. By the time you'd sorted the kickstart, the choke, the carburetor, and everything else on this list, there was still one small, thin cable quietly doing its job beneath the headlight, the one connecting your front wheel to the needle on your speedometer. A gear at the wheel hub spun a flexible cable running up through the forks to the speedometer, turning the needle purely through mechanical rotation. No electronics, no sensor, nothing measuring anything digitally, just a spinning cable translating wheel speed directly into a number you could read. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't something riders bonded with the way they bonded with a carburetor. But it worked reliably for years, and when it did fail, usually the cable fraying or the drive gear wearing out, you knew instantly, because the needle would start jumping erratically or drop to zero altogether, right in the middle of a ride. Electronic speed sensors eventually replaced it, more accurate and immune to cable wear entirely. Nobody misses a frayed Speedo cable, but it was one more small, honest, fully mechanical part doing exactly what it promised. Nothing more, nothing less. A fitting way to end a list built entirely on parts that asked something of you and gave something back. 10 parts, 10 small rituals, all replaced by systems that ask nothing of you anymore. If you rode any of these yourself, you already know exactly what we're talking about. Drop your own memory in the comments and subscribe for more of what motorcycles used to demand from the people who rode them.